So I'd like to invite Nick Klomp, who is the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Education here at the university and also a member of the board of the Rees Archives of Australian Children's Literature. And Nick is invited to give his welcoming address. Nick, over to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the University of Canberra and to this event, the Colin Thiele, His Work and Legacy. As Max has said, I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Education, but really I'm here as one of the members of the board of the Rees Archive, and I'm delighted to be part of the Rees Archive, and you'll hear about some of its work in a moment. And I send my apologies from our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Stephen Parker, AO, who couldn't be here. In fact, he's overseas, couldn't be here this evening, but is also a great supporter of the Rees Archives. Can I start, as we always do at all official events of the University of Canberra, by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land in which we've gathered here today. They're the Ngunnawal people, and I acknowledge and pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Indigenous people here today. This event is part of the Colin Thiele Festival, organised by the Rees Archives, coinciding with the Barking Gecko Theatre Company and the Sydney Theatre Company's co-production of Storm Boy, which begins in Canberra tomorrow night. It's very exciting. Another aspect of the festival overall is an exhibition at the Civic Library, which features part of the archive's extensive Colin Thiele collection and items lent for the exhibition by the Thiele family. For those of you who don't know, I suspect most of you do, the Rees Archives holds one of the largest collections relating to Colin Thiele and his work anywhere in the world. 385 different editions. 385, can that be right? That 385 different editions and almost 100 editions in various translations. 20 in German, 19 in Dutch. These are different editions. These aren't just copies. 11 in Swedish. Other languages include Afrikaans, Czech, French, Japanese. Really, really an impressive collection. In preparing for this evening, I started to think about my interaction with Colin Thiele and his books. And I mean, it was just a few hours ago when I started putting the notes together, and I wonder whether you've all gone through the same thing when you thought about coming here this evening, reminding yourself of the joy of reading some of his books. The thing that struck me more than anything, I admit to reading Storm Boy and Bluefin, and I absolutely loved Sun on the Stubble. I thought it never got enough praise, Sun on the Stubble. But it made me realise as I was preparing some of these notes, I've got so much more reading to go, because of course Colin Thiele is the author of up to over 100 books, I understand. And although most of them children's literature, not all of them children's literature. So I am miles behind, I bet, nearly everyone in this audience here. I've got plenty to go, and I'm really looking forward to the presenters this evening. Because tonight, through various presentations, and I'll talk to you about who's presenting in a moment, we're hearing from people from a range of different backgrounds, or if you like, special relationships with Colin Thiele and his work. So we'll really get to know him better, and we'll get to celebrate his achievements as what is obviously Australia's preeminent children's author. We'll hear from Janne Minge. Janne is Colin Thiele's daughter and the family spokesman for his legacy. She's also a terrific friend of the Rees Archives, and I warned her that I would embarrass her and her family on how generous she has been with the Rees Archive. We're helping fill in the gaps of our Colin Thiele collection and donating a large number of books, including many translations. And indeed, many items lent from her family personal items that are currently on display at the Civic Library at the exhibition there too. So make sure you get along to that as well. We'll be hearing from Walter McVitty. As a publisher, Walter McVitty Books, Walter published 14 of Colin Thiele's books. Walter has also made really significant donations to the archives. Overall, it included he has donated publications of 57 children's books published by his company. And there is something else that I've learnt a little bit more about today, and that is he's given to the Rees Archives. By the way, for those of you who don't know, the Rees Archives is based here at the University of Canberra in our library, just here, and really absolutely worth a visit if you, anytime, doesn't have to be during this festival, anytime you're most welcome. But Walter McVitty donated his publisher's archives. Publishing archives in public institutions anywhere in the world are extremely rare. And this is something that I've learnt today. In fact, there are only 5 held across Australia. And of these, only 2 relate to publishing of children's books. And the Rees Archives holds them both. So it really is an impressive archive and really very, very generous of you, Walter. Thank you very much. We'll hear from Margaret Carmody, who's an academic at the Australian Catholic University here in Canberra and has studied and written about Colin Thielen's work. And a copy of her thesis, by the way, you won't be surprised to hear that actually that's also in the archives. Her thesis, The Children's Fiction of Colin Thiele, is one of 39 theses relating to studies of children's authors and children's literature that we hold in the archive. And I joked with Margaret just then that not only am I looking forward to hearing her presentation, but her thesis is very likely to be one of those theses that is actually read by lots of different people, as opposed to my thesis that I suspect only 3 people actually read. And one of them was my mother, so she had to read it. And then finally, we'll be hearing from John Sheedy. And I made the mistake of saying, hey, John, good luck from tomorrow night. I know you're not meant to say good luck, John, but John is the artistic director at the Barking Gecko Theatre Company. And of course, as I've mentioned, the Barking Gecko Theatre Company is co-producing Stormboy with the Sydney Theatre Company, and it starts tomorrow. This is following a sellout premiere season a couple of years ago in Sydney, and now it is going on a regional tour of Wollongong, Geelong, Canberra, Mandurah and Perth. That is going to be incredible, and I'm sure many of you will be attending that as well. So, okay, break a leg or whatever the appropriate thing is. Thanks very much. It's good. Oh, good. Thanks, John. Hey, listen, the very best thing for me to do now is to sit down and shut up and listen to the range of speakers now. I'm really looking forward to it, and I'm sure I'll see many of you at some of the other events of this festival. Thanks very much, everybody. Thanks, Max.
Thank you, Nick, for setting the stage for this evening's entertainment. I'd now like to call on Janne Minge to recall memories of a father. Her talk is entitled Memories of a Gentle Man. Janne?
When I was 6 years old, I went into Dad's study and said, "There's a mistake in this book." Dad looked at it. It was not one of his books. Dad looked at it and said, "No, dear, the book is right." And then he explained that just as you would never say, "She gave it to I," you would also never say, "She gave it to Mummy and I." 8 years later, I went to Dad's study and said, "We have to learn this poem for homework. And I've been trying for ages and I can't remember it." Dad looked at it and said, "Go to bed. Read the poem once before you switch off the light and then stop thinking about it. I'll wake you early so that you have time for more practice." The next morning I woke up and found that I knew the poem. These 2 unremarkable stories show things about my father. We could usually find him in his study. He could always answer our questions. He never made us feel as though our interruptions were interruptions. He could teach a clear lesson with a few well-chosen words. There was a time in my life when I considered my father to be different to other fathers. It wasn't because he was well known, he wasn't then. Although the day would eventually come when he would be delivered a letter that had been addressed to Mr Colin Thiele, Australia. I knew that he'd written poetry and radio scripts and a couple of textbooks for his English and geography classes, but to a child, those were merely interesting historical facts. The bulk of his life's work was as yet unwritten, and I didn't understand then the uniqueness of his intellect. My perspective was based on the stereotypes I met in books. Critical literature wasn't taught so much in those days, and I must have been the kind of reader who didn't think very deeply, because I believed that normal dads were backyard game-playing kinds of people, and mine wasn't. He worked on his own, in his study. It was rare for a 3-bedroom suburban post-war house to even have a study, but we were able to have one because my sister Sandy and I shared a bedroom. Later in life, I came to understand that every dad is unique, and that my own dad's uniqueness was due to much more than working at a desk. The wonderful letters written to members of the family, and especially to Mum after his death, had several recurring themes. His storytelling and conversation, his giftedness as a teacher, educator, mentor, speaker, lecturer, his love for the environment, and of course, his writing. And featuring just as much were personal qualities: humour, diplomacy, courage in adversity, a generous spirit. For Dad's legacy was not only from the things he had done, but from the man he had been. And my most special memories are not of the big things, like the success of Stormboy or the Order of Australia Award, but of a host of unremarkable moments. Dad was mild-mannered. His temperament was even. He never lost his temper. He didn't criticise, berate, or hold grudges. He didn't waste energy on anxiety, panic, or bitterness. He found whimsy and humour in situations that could well have exasperated others. An elderly acquaintance wrote of him, "I recall a man so humble despite his success, a man of permanent good humour, a man of incredible fortitude." A publisher wrote, "He restored my faith in human nature every time I talked to him." From a lifelong colleague, "I don't think I have ever thought of Colin without a pervading sense of gladness." Some of these statements are in the books at the back of the room that you can look at afterwards. And from a fellow teacher in the 1950s, "It was a great experience being on the same staff as Colin. He enlivened the staff room with many of his stories. He was so well organised and hardworking, and so tactful, patient, and helpful. And his students counted them very lucky to have been taught by him. I must admit that I was very glad some of them chose to put a snake in his case one day rather than mine. Apparently, he quietly closed the case and borrowed a book for the lesson." For all Dad's gentleness, he also had strength. He related well with people of all ages, but also found joy in solitude. He was assertive. "I'm sorry, but it's a bad contract," he wrote to someone who had submitted one for his consideration. He refused to budge on the title of Son of the Stubble or the length of Stormboy. A friend once said to him and about him, "Good teachers are not rare. Your talent as a teacher was of a different order. You could engage the interest of everybody, tots, kids, teenagers, lecture-weary students, educated adults, and of colleagues like me." A letter written to the Adelaide Advertiser in September 2006 elaborated on his ability to relate to the very young. "About 25 years ago, my late wife was teaching at a school that Colin Thiele visited. She was enchanted to see him sit and listen intently to a child telling him the story of a film she had seen called Stormboy. Colin asked questions about the film as if the tale was new to him. Lovely." Pain was an integral part of Dad's entire life, and he faced it with fortitude. He had rheumatoid arthritis, as his parents had had, a condition that affects the joints in particular. He didn't complain much, but it could be seen in his everyday actions. His misshapen hands, fingers and feet, the way he balanced his coffee cup on his palm, the way he held a biro, the way he balanced his baby grandchildren awkwardly across his elbows, his hobbling walk. He had great tolerance for pain. 4 years before he died, my aunt noticed a nasty sore on the sole of one of his feet. It was discovered that he had ulceration through to the bone, and he had an arterial bypass operation. He later said, "I knew it had been hurting a lot, but I thought it was just the arthritis playing up." On another occasion, he said over the phone, "My arm's sore. I must have done something to it when I rolled over in bed the other night." "Are you going to see the doctor?" I asked. "If it's still hurting in a month, I probably will." A few days later, he had surgery. One of his 7 artificial joints, an elbow, had moved a couple of centimetres out of alignment. When asked by a reporter to name his special virtue and his special vice, Dad gave the same answer for each: rigid punctuality. Dad always needed to know the time. When planning for an outing, he would check the street directory earlier in the day, sketch a map if necessary, and let us know when we would need to leave. For a year or two, he tried setting the clock 5 minutes ahead of time, but because we mentally deducted those 5 minutes whenever we looked at the clock, this strategy was unsuccessful. In the 70s and 80s, when Mum and Dad visited my family at Victor Harbour on Saturdays, we would look out of the window at exactly noon and see their car pulling quietly into the driveway. Dad was a busy man, a leader in his workplace, invited to many functions, asked to work on many projects, and a prolific writer, yet he lived life in an unhurried manner. He was tidy, organised, and disciplined. He received letters constantly and in large numbers, and he answered most of them within 2 or 3 days. I remember when he was in the USA on his Fulbright and he wanted a paper from his filing cabinet, wrote one of his former colleagues to Mum. And you rang me relaying his exact instructions as to where it was, and of course I found it immediately. Dad's fascination for language, its subtleties and its complexities was always within him. His mother said he set off for school at the age of 4.5, speaking only German, and returned that day speaking entirely in English. At 16, he met university entrance qualifications by learning 4 years of high school Latin in a few months. Throughout his life, he could quote lengthy passages from literature. I have treasured memories of some of Dad's more colourful and occasionally politically incorrect sayings. When we were running late, "Come on, we won't get to see the fat woman." This was borrowed from the days when travelling freak shows had been popular. When we went for family drives, "Let's stop and get a Marilyn Monroe." And that was one of those old-fashioned side-by-side double-header ice creams. When he was 75 years old, "Jan, I'm 5 years past my use-by date," which worries me because I'm getting closer to that time myself all the time. One borrowed from Somerset Maugham, "Only a mediocre writer is always at his best." Annotations he made to his rainfall records at Dayborough in Queensland. "Piddling little showers. Another useless dribble. Ferocious storms. Tanks gushing over. A miserable total. Whole communities out of water." Dad loved to yarn and tell stories, and dinner was all the richer for the lengthy conversations that followed. "What a wonderful conversation we had at our meal," wrote a friend from the 1950s. Colin led the way with his stories of life and people on the Eyre Peninsula, and we were with him. A story was retold about his days as a teachers' college principal, when he became concerned about a boy who was walking around the college with a large book titled How to Hug, until it was realised it was only volume 13 of the Encyclopaedia Britannica. And a young neighbour from the 1980s remembered rushing into his study at Wattle Park after mowing the lawn to listen to the stories that would flow forth. I was fond of Dad's story about the Tiwi Islander, he discovered watching Wild-Eyed while he was washing his false teeth. This was during the war. He called the boy over and put on a bit of a performance, replacing his teeth and taking them out again a few times. Minutes later, the boy returned with friends and beckoned to Dad to repeat the trick. Another story was about when he and a friend who studied anthropology were invited by the islanders to watch some ceremonial dancing. Partway through the display, it was explained that they were about to see a very special dance being performed for the first time. During the dance, the friend whispered, "You know what we're watching, don't you? They're reenacting the bombing of Darwin." Dad was my personal encyclopedia. His knowledge of Australian history and geography and Australian and English literature was vast, but he could chat at length about a variety of subjects: the culture and history of the Kurds, the writing of Virgil, Shackleton's leadership in the Antarctic. On family driving holidays, he would occasionally stop, perhaps to explain the Snowy Mountains scheme or to show us where an explorer had walked. A few hours after his heart valve operation, having first praised medical technology for allowing him to attend to his toileting needs without even leaving his bed, he talked at length about Macbeth. Our niece had a school assignment that focused on feminism, and he believed that this distracted from the play's essence and richness. In August 2006, when Dad's artificial mitral valve was failing and he'd known for a month or two that he was dying, I sat with him in the spot he liked under the shed veranda, and he talked for 40 minutes or so about the history of the Palestinian people. 3 weeks later, I had the privilege of sitting beside him when he died. Soon afterwards, I rang my husband, who rang our children. Our daughter, a teacher, took the call and then called her Year 1 class around her. She said, "The reason I'm crying is because I've just found out that my grandpa has died." "Oh no, not Colin," said a 5-year-old girl. "I don't understand why you're crying," said a boy. "When someone you love dies, it's very sad," explained our daughter. "But he's not sad," said the child. "He's probably eating chocolate with Jesus now." Later, one of his illustrators wrote to Mum, "I could hear when we last spoke on the telephone that he was sounding fragile, yet he still made me laugh and laugh." And my last words come from a reader. "It surprises me that I have shed so many tears for the loss of one I didn't really know personally, and yet his gift is that I feel I did. How much more the grieving and joy of you who shared his life and heart." Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Jan. While I was sitting there, I was thinking to myself, what a wonderful world it would be if we all had dads like Colin Thiele, a man who could make reading rainfall records interesting. Our next speaker is Margaret Carmody from the Australian Catholic University here in Canberra. Margaret has chosen for her talk the title, "Birds Like Mr Percival Do Not Really Die." Now, this is not an ornithological talk, I'm assured. It is to do with Colin Thiele. Margaret, the floor is yours.
Okay, so people seldom saw Hideaway or Stormboy. Now and then when they sailed up the Coorong in their little boat, past the strange wild inlet of the Murray Mouth, past the islands and the reedy fringes of the freshwater shore, past the pelicans and the ibises and the tall white cranes, to the little town with a name like a water bird's cry, Gulwa. If you have a look on the map there, you can see around the mouth of the Murray. It's impossible to get a map of the Coorong that you can actually fit onto a screen and still read the names on it, because it's 90 miles long. It's 146 kilometres long. It's a huge, huge area. So that'll give you some idea of what the mouth of the Murray is like. I'm not sure exactly where Stormboy lived. I think he probably lived just along there before where the actual sanctuary starts. So you can see that to go into Goolwa with his father in a little sailing boat, possibly rowing if there wasn't much wind, was quite a journey. It's huge, especially going past the mouth of the Murray. Stormboy is the tale of a boy called Stormboy and his father, who was called Hideaway Tom. And they live in a shack on the Coorong, which is in the southeast of South Australia, right near the mouth of the Murray when it happens to be open. The Coorong is a long lagoon with a sandbar that separates it from the Southern Ocean. It's full of fish and bird life, and the sandhills protect it from the relentless crashing seas of the Southern Ocean. And when I was a girl, I used to live near there. Now, what I want you to do now is I want you to make one of those maps of Australia. You know how you make one like that? So have a go at doing it. Now, you see the bit of your thumb from where the joint is up to the tip of your thumb? Well, that's the Coorong. Okay. Now you can understand that. Stormboy doesn't go to school. He spends his days in much the same way as an Aboriginal child living in the Coorong before the advent of the Europeans. His father is a fisherman, and their life is a peaceful, relaxed and non-materialistic one. They're totally in harmony with the environment. And Stormboy, as we know, has a pet, and the pet is a pelican called Mr Percival. Fingerbone Bill is an old Aboriginal who is the last of his tribe who originally occupied the Coorong. He lives close to Stormboy and Hideaway, and he's Stormboy's companion and tutor during the long days when Hideaway is out in his boat fishing. Fingerbone teaches Stormboy to love and respect the environment. When shooters come into the Coorong, there are many issues poignantly raised, because when people break the rules, people suffer. In Stormboy, nature is wonderful, but at the same time it is unpredictable and it is harsh, it's unforgiving and it is very destructive. Stormboy was not the first book to be set in the Coorong. Simpson Newland's book called Paving the Way, which came out in 1893, and another of his books called A Band of Pioneers, which he wrote in 1919, are descriptions of the early European settlement of Encounter Bay and the Coorong. They include commentary on the Aboriginal people in the area, and this did not make Newland popular. One of the interesting things is the way that Newland described the sea. He talked about the eternal roar of the sea. And if you think that Simpson Newland was in that first boatload of Europeans that settled in Encounter Bay when he was only 4, his memory was of the roar of the sea, and talked about the terrors of the conflicting waters near the mouth of the Murray and of the stormy waters of that tempestuous bay. Thiele's Coorong, though, was the 1950s, late 1950s, early 1960s, and which is the time when I actually lived near there. There's a few interesting things about the Coorong at that time. For a start, there was absolutely no communication whatsoever down there. There was no postal deliveries, no newspapers. There were hardly any shops in Goolwa. There was no telephone. There was no electricity, because my father was one of the people who put the power poles in down there. One of the interesting things is that cameras at the time that most people would have had could not have taken the sort of photos that you now see of the Coorong. They couldn't get the detail in the distance. So if you took a photo of the Coorong, it really didn't look like much at all. No camera could capture it as he did with his words. There were still a few Aboriginal people who lived down in the Coorong, but it was a long distance by water to Goolwa, and there was enormous waves and enormous energy in the sea. Another thing is that there were snakes everywhere, and I know from walking along in the sandhills myself, there's huge numbers of snakes everywhere. There was no farming in the Coorong. It wasn't suitable for farming, but there was farming on High Marsh Island where there were dairies. There were sandhills and a stretch of water and the sea beyond. It was really a very uninspiring landscape. But Colin Thiele's imagination makes it inspirational. After a big blow, in places the sand would be rucked and puckered into hard, smooth ripples like scales. Stormboy liked to scuff them with his bare soles as he walked, or balance on their cool curves with the balls of his feet. Stormboy has a sensual, tactile appreciation of nature. He spends his days in the vast Coorong environment barefoot and dressed in shabby old clothes. Quote, most of the time he wore nothing but shorts, a shirt and a battered old Tom Sawyer hat. In winter, he was in his father's old coats, snug as a penguin in a burrow. By referencing a previous work, namely Tom Sawyer, we can see that Thiele's approach is at times postmodernist. The world for Hideaway has fallen apart and he avoids the modern consumer culture. The essential things about Colin Thiele's books, all of his children's books, is firstly a remote, unattractive, uninspiring location. Secondly, there's usually an element of an end of childhood, start of adolescence. The language is quite remarkable, the use of language. And the values that are embedded in his literature are also remarkable. A terrible ruin of whites, water and spray. Colin Thiele brought to life places we don't value or see very much of, places like Coopedi. Who else has said a children's book in Coopedi? No one, I don't think. The inner, rundown suburbs of Adelaide. Windswept shores of South Australia, over on Kangaroo Island, at Port Lincoln and the Coorong itself. He set books in the Barossa, but it wasn't the Barossa that's the trendy wine growing area now. It was when it was wheat farming area. The Coorong has dangerous waters. It has had many shipwrecks. It's a swampy environment. It's the home of the Ngarrindjeri people. Port Lincoln is a remote and dangerous place where they engage in the fishing in very dangerous seas, and it has an absolutely horrible tuna processing plant, which Thiele writes about in his book. This was not the Australia that Queen Elizabeth saw when she came here in February to March 1954 and visited 157 towns. It was the longest trip of a royal person since Alexander the Great, apparently. No one else has ever done such a trip. But she didn't go to the Coorong. Ward's Australian legend argues for the equality of bush life. This is the real Australia of Ward's Australian legend. The 1960s, late 1950s, brought about a review of what it means to be an Australian and a review of our landscape. There was the famous coffee table book called The Australians by Goodman. I'm sure some of you my age had one of them on their coffee table when they were kids. Like Lawson, Thiele has expanded the narrative to include people and places that you don't usually write about. Everywhere there were crisscrossing wakes of ripples and waves and splashes. Stormboy felt the excitement and the wonder of it. He often sat on the shore all day with his knees up and his chin cupped in his hands. An interesting thing about Thiele is that he has a particular view of childhood, and it involves a set of things. The first one is that the child enjoys great freedom in a natural setting. The next one is reminiscent of Rousseau's Emile, in that the child usually has a tutor, someone who's not their parent or actually in the family, or immediate family, but they play that role of the tutor, just like in Emile. The child has duties and responsibilities, which is quite unusual in this day and age. The child is part of a family, but it is often not what you would call a Weet-Bix family. In this case, it's a family of a single father and his child. In the case of Son on the Stubble, it's an extended family with 3 generations all living together, and you could go on with different examples. And the last thing that is remarkable about his view of children, of what constitutes childhood, is an awareness of natural beauty on the part of the child. In this book, Thiele poses the question, how does Stormboy learn if he doesn't go to school? What does he know? There seems to be some influences on Thiele's attitudes to education that we can discern when we unpack his book, all 60 pages of it. He seems to have been influenced by Vygotsky's ideas about how children learn, that reasoning emerges through practical activity in the social environment, the role of play in children's development, and the importance of imagination in learning. In the 1960s, of course, Piaget was the latest flavour of the month, and we can see, using Piaget, that Stormboy is at the concrete operational stage because he thinks logically, he's no longer egocentric, and he's aware of logic and classification. So he classifies the 3 Mr. P's. Remember how he classifies them to his father? There's other examples too. Stormboy progressively builds an understanding by acting on and reflecting on his previous knowledge, for instance, about snakes. Stormboy builds his learning, and his learning is supported by instructors such as his father, when his father teaches him how to train Mr. Percival. He constructs his own moral view of the world, and he forms his ideas of right and wrong. However, generally, Thiele challenges Piaget's theory of a hierarchy of learning. Stormboy owes much to Rousseau's Emile, which of course was about the relationship of the individual and society, but Stormboy, while he's in the Coorong, is not in society. It was the year of the great storm. And then Stormboy says, we must help them, they will be drowned. The great storm signals the end of childhood for Stormboy. In Stormboy, we see hard themes. We see death, we see loss of a parent, we see loneliness. There's a catastrophe, and the child must assume the adult role as he buries his pet pelican. Life is never the same again. Children are and ought to be interested in financial literacy, in mechanical and industrial and environmental issues, in facing up to mental health problems, to politics and to law. The definition of literacy for Thiele includes political and financial realities. The reality of how do you attend school when you're in a remote location, the reality of having to dig up cockle shells to sell when he's only a child. There's great attention given to grief, to bereavement and to loss, particularly at the end of the story. Thiele has captured that significant moment when a child goes from being a child to being an adolescent. Hideaway tied wires to the walls and weighed down the roof with driftwood and stones. He spread extra clothing on the bunks. What do we know from this? They were poor. They didn't have spare blankets. If you were cold, you had to put your overcoat over you. This lifestyle is like the early whalers who had seen better days and who were very silent sorts of people that Newland described in the middle of the 19th century. There's implications of possible mental health problems, of retreat, of escape from a catastrophe of his wife's death in Hideaway. The missing element in this book is women. There are no women in Storm Boy, none that I could see anyhow. In the early days, it was the mothers who taught the children, and he doesn't have a mother to teach him. The traditional use of the Coorong was as a recreational area where they had motor races and fishing and shooting. It was a place to escape to. It was remote, lonely and harsh. Again and again through the night, he slipped out of bed and tiptoes across the dirt floor to the fireplace to make sure the baby pelican was warm enough. Another quote. A thin stream of black glass barred with red hot coals. And another example, a snippery, snappery, snickery, snackery sort of sound like dry reeds crackling. The language that Thiele uses is remarkable. I don't remember reading those particular images anywhere else in English literature. I mean, I stand to be corrected. Anyone correct me? No. They're original images. He's also extremely good at writing technical descriptions when he describes how to teach Mr P to catch a ball, or how they looped the cord so that it wouldn't tangle as it went out to the boat when they were rescuing. His descriptions of landscape are remarkable. The themes and moods and meanings are conveyed by the literary elements in this book. There's no photos, there's no illustrations in the original. The characters develop, they change. They're not like the meagre characters that you have in people such as Mary Grant Bruce or Enid Blyton, which is not a very nice word to say, Enid Blyton, but anyhow. All day long, Storm Boy held Mr Percival in his arms in front of the rough iron stove where not long ago he had nursed the little bruised pelican into life. He now sat motionless and silent. He's amazing at capturing that feeling of the moment. His poetic imagery is also remarkable. He describes a sunrise as, quote, like a blazing penny. I'm old enough to remember what a penny looked like. There's a lot of Christian imagery in his book. The pelican, of course, is a reference to Psalm 102, I am like a pelican of the wilderness. The pelican is a symbol of self-sacrifice and nurturing, and it's no mistake that when Storm Boy is injured, he has blood moistening his white chest feathers, just like a mother pelican will vuln her breast for her young ones. About Fingerbone, he says, he could read all the strange writing on the sandhills and beaches, the scribbly stories made by beetles and mice and bandicoots and anteaters and crabs and birds' toes and mysterious sliding bellies in the night. Before long, Storm Boy had learnt enough to fill 100 books. Writing about Indigenous Australians, Colin Thiele has a particular view of Indigenous history, both mythical and real, which is represented in the character of Fingerbone Bill. There are certain histories we cannot opt out of here and now. For instance, the history of relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. This makes him an important writer. There are values embedded in Storm Boy, such as care and compassion for yourself and for others. The concept of fair go, a sense of shared experience, mutual respect and unconditional assistance is demonstrated in the rescue. Integrity, where Storm Boy and his father act on ethical principles. They are honest and trustworthy and sincere. They have understanding of tolerance, and they have an enormous respect for the environment. All living creatures were his friends. So why is Storm Boy a classic? Why are we here tonight talking about a book that was just a part of a collection of short stories in 1963? It's a classic because it deals with the great themes that face us all. It provides a commentary on life, and it shows us what it is to be a good citizen. It examines what constitutes education, which I find very interesting. It provides an Indigenous view of the landscape of education and of friendship. And it uses creative language which is original, which is evocative, descriptive and analytical. It is good literature about the human condition and it is beautifully written. This is Colin Thiele's description of the boat coming home after Stormboy and his father have let the 3 pelicans go in the park. The sun was flinging a million golden mirrors in a lane across the water. It glowed on the bare patches of the sandhills and lit up the bushes and tussocks till every stem and twig shone with rosy fire. The little boat came gliding into shore through the chuckle of the ripples. Have you ever read that before? A chuckle of ripples? No, I haven't either. He's a major figure in the movement to define what it is to be an Australian. In his writing, there is the idea that Australia itself is something worth thinking about. He's building the Australian identity around the people and what they do. He embraces the Australianness of the people he writes about. He was actually ahead of himself because this movement really came about in the 1970s in the Whitlam era, and it's not a surprise that there was government funding for the film, which we won't mention tonight. More than anything else, Colin Thiele writes about the ordinariness of people's lives. We can see the echoes of the themes and concerns of the great writers and artists such as Lawson, such as McCubbin with his lost children, such as Hyson capturing the light and the colour and mood of the Australian bush. Like Lawson, Thiele believed the Australian identity must emanate from Australia, not from Great Britain. In each case in Thiele's books, the character who is adventurous, who is able to range freely, who is free at some time in his life, has to come to terms with society. This view of our societies is based on the work ethic, which held that hard work means you're going to be saved. In each of Thiele's books, this concept is closely examined and it is found to be flawed. Hideaway and Stormboy have no money, they have very few possessions, yet they are good people and we admire them a lot. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Having driven along the Coorong a couple of years ago on a sealed road, I think you're very privileged to have experienced the Coorong in your early days. There's been a slight change to the program. I'm going to call on John Sheedy, the artistic director at the Barking Gecko Theatre Company, to address us. John has to get away and be back at the theatre by 7 o'clock to meet up with the cast. But, and I think we may have 5 minutes for questions if anyone has any questions for John, but only five minutes. We don't have a lot of time available to us tonight. So John, would you like to talk to our group? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me tonight. It's really wonderful to be here. And Jan and Margaret, it's wonderful to hear your talks. And, particularly Jan, hear your childhood and growing up and all about your father and his stories. And, of course, as a director, when you grab hold of a story, one that takes hold of you emotionally and takes hold of your imagination, you go, actually, I would love to turn that into a theatre piece. You do an enormous amount of research, but you never get to the personal side of it. So, Jan, that was just absolutely wonderful to hear that. I really enjoyed it. And I wish the rest of the cast and creatives could have been here to hear that. And I'll be certainly telling them a few tales when I go back to the theatre. I do apologise that I have to run off, but I do have to tech the show, and I have actors and creatives and also some very naughty pelicans waiting to get on stage. Look, when I first started at Barking Gecko Theatre Company as the artistic director. Now, Barking Gecko Theatre Company produces and presents shows for children and families. And when I first sat in the hot seat there, I was at my desk. It was the first day, and I had to create a whole new repertoire of works for young people. And I thought, right, what is the one story that stayed with me as a childhood? And Storm Boy came to my mind straight away. Bang, instantly. The story about the boy and the bird on the beach. I grew up in Torquay, Victoria, on the beach. And we had a few pelicans around us. And I remember the book at primary school. I remember there was only the one copy. And you used to have to put your name down to what's the word I'm looking for? To borrow. But you would have a waiting list. And Mrs. Rhodes was very strict, our library teacher. She was lovely. And occasionally she would read it to us. But and I'd go, oh, Mrs. Rhodes, how many is on the waiting list for Storm Boy? And she'd say, John, you'll have to be patient and wait. There's a couple. There's 5 ahead of you. And I'm like, all right, okay. Anyway, I just loved it for all these reasons. Like I said, I grew up on the beach at Torquay, and I loved the idea of a boy not having to go to school and spend all his days on the beach running up and down, and his best mate is a pelican. What kid doesn't want that in primary school? But no, I had to get up in the freezing cold and then get in my school uniform and go to school and do math. It just wasn't fair. Anyway, I loved the story for that. It was a fantasy world for me. But one thing about that story that stayed with me is the very beautiful and melancholy undercurrent in that story. And I guess that is why that book and that particular story and those characters have stayed with me my whole life. Because I invested so much as a small boy in that bird, in that friendship, in that landscape. And I was heartbroken when Mr. Percival went. I just couldn't believe that Mr. Percival died. And I would always go back and read it again to go, are you sure? Are you sure he's gone? And, Proud and Ponder, I mean, they're greedy gutses. They ate everything and they flew off. But Mr. P came back, and that's what I loved most of all, that bird came back. And then he saved the sailors. It has all the wonderful ingredients. And that is why I believe it's a classic to this day. When I choose a story, particularly to tell young people, I always try and choose a story that creates a larger conversation, that isn't patronising. It's very easy to present a story on stage for children and families that is full of colour and movement. And some people think, well, that's all they need. They're entertained because people are jumping around. There's lots of colours. There's a couple of big animal costumes. I'm not for that. I don't want to patronise our young people. I believe our young people should be able to have our trust that they will navigate themselves emotionally through a story without being spoon-fed or hand-fed, to allow them to experience and have all those emotions wash over them and through them, and then be able to ask questions afterwards and create a larger conversation. And it probably starts in the foyer when they walk out, and it probably sits in the car on the way home, and it probably sits in the bedroom as you put your kids to bed, and then the conversation will happen again the next morning, and hopefully for the next week, and hopefully for months. Any good piece of storytelling will do that, and it will stay with you. And like, I guess, Sean Tan, we've done a couple of Sean Tans. Sean Tan is wonderful and very brave with the themes he chooses to put into stories for young people. Now, we've heard Margaret talk about some of the themes in Storm Boy. And grief is a very large theme in Storm Boy. And, as I said, it's not just about a friendship between a boy and a bird. It's about masculinity and grief. They're all men. When you look at it, Hideaway Tom has lost his wife. Storm Boy has lost his mother. Fingerbone Bill has lost his community. And the 3 Pelicans, all boys, have lost their mother. It's all these boys and men in this remote area that have run away, have taken themselves out of society to deal with some traumatic event. And I find that both heartbreaking and beautiful, and you know, like Storm Boy with those little birds, I want to fix them too. And there is one female in the story, Mrs. Fairy Penguin. Mrs. Fairy Penguin right at the beginning with her 2 little eggs. We have Mrs. Fairy Penguin because we sat there and went, it's all boys, and a lot of the creatives in the team that put this show together, there's a lot of men in there. I said, we need a woman. We need some girls. Come on. We got Mrs. Fairy Penguin and who else? And luckily we got a wonderful crew, female crew as well. And so they are always kind of pitching for Mrs. Fairy Penguin, which is very, very funny. It's a wonderful collaboration. I enjoy a story, and particularly as a creator and someone that produces and programs, I sit up the back and I'm very privileged because I get to watch it. I put it all together. And what I love is when I'm sitting up the back and there's a moment where the children lean forward. And when they're leaning forward, I go, I've got you. You're there. We have performed close to almost 70 performances of Storm Boy from when we first premiered it in 2013 up till now. And I tell you, without a lie, every single show, they lean forward. And I love it because they want to know more. They're so involved in the story and they don't fidget. They don't get, distracted. They are so engaged in that beautiful piece of storytelling. And it's not just the staging from me, I'd like to think it is, wonderful performances, but it's those carefully selected words of Colin Thiele. Now, how do you find a writer to honour Colin's words and works and to represent one of such a beautiful Australian classic? And it is one of the most loved stories in Australia. When I programmed Storm Boy, and people would say, what are you doing next? What's next at Barking Echo? I go, well, we're actually teaming up with the Sydney Theatre Company and we're doing a production of Storm Boy. Unanimously, you'd hear this, oh, everyone would go, oh, everyone has their own memory of Storm Boy, over 3 generations. And my auntie Jan, God bless her, to this day, whenever she drives by and sees a pelican, she goes, oh, look, it's Mr. Percival. Every time. There's a lot of people that do that. And so choosing a writer to adapt that is very tricky. You don't want to get it wrong. There's a lot of pressure in that. And Tom Holloway, who I think is one of the best Australian playwrights in this country, and around the world, he's got a lot of works around the world, has a beautiful economic quality and approach to his writing, which I think honours Colin's works, carefully selected words. He's done a beautiful job adapting it. There's an enormous amount of trust that goes in there, and he's created an hour and 15 straight through of this wonderful story, honouring all the details. We have Michael Scott Mitchell, who has designed this incredible set, and Michael and I, it took 3 years to create this show, by the way. After it was 6 months negotiating the rights, as it should do, because it is such a favourite, and they want it to be in the right hands. And so it took 6 months to negotiate the rights and then another 3 years to turn it into a play with 4 creative developments. And I took it to the Sydney Theatre Company and I sat there, I made an appointment with, and then it was Andrew Upton and Kate Blanchett were joint artistic directors and CEOs of the company. And I sat there in the office and I said, I'd like to do Storm Boy. And they both went, oh, we love it. We love it. They have their own memories of Storm Boy. So we had this great conversation about what my ideas are about how we would do what the concept would be, and of course the $1 million question arrived: how are we going to do the Pelicans? How? And for about a good 3 seconds there, we thought about real ones. 3 seconds too long, and then I went, you know what? Working with children and animals, no way. Children, sure. And so we came up with puppetry. we came up with puppets. And Michael Scott Mitchell has done a wonderful job designing the set and the Pelicans, and they are to scale. And we made some prototypes, and we have had a wonderful time with them. And they waddle around, and they click and clack, and they peck Hideaway Tom on the bottom, and they flap their wings, and they fly around. They open up and their wings, and they fly. They play fetch. They do everything that a pelican can do. And so there was years of working with these different prototypes. Michael Scott Mitchell, the designer, and I went to the Coorong, and we went on a bit of a recce, and we spent 2 days there photographing, walking across the sand dunes and getting all the details that you can. And Kingsley Reeve, who is the sound designer, he actually went to the Coorong and he camped there for a week on his own. And he just spent the entire time recording the ocean, recording the rippling of the water, recording the birds, recording pelicans, recorded everything he could. And so he has created this very authentic and wonderful landscape that the audience can really submerge into. We have a wonderful set, which is almost a sculptural piece, really, and that Michael Scott Mitchell has designed. And it is this beautiful wave. It's also a shoreline. It's a sand dune, and the Humpy sits underneath. And it's a very simple but clever way of creating the world of Storm Boy and Hideaway Tom, and being able to create multiple locations. We then got our fishing boat, and it's not a motorised one. It has oars, and it's a little bit famous, this fishing boat. It's the fishing boat from the very famous production of Cloud Street, and we got it for a bargain price of $300 from Belvoir Street, and I couldn't believe they got rid of it. We'll take that, thanks. So there's a bit of pedigree on that stage there. We watched Pelicans. We played videos of Pelicans. We got their behaviour, we listened to them. And one of the things I love in this story is the education that comes between Fingerbone Bill and Storm Boy. I think it's a beautiful education there about the land and the animals, and about moving forward as well, and about the shifting landscapes. And what I wanted to do with the puppeteers is I wasn't interested in hiding the puppeteers. I wasn't interested in them wearing black lycra and pretending they're not there to Japanese flute music, you know. That's just not our world. And so we talked about who the puppeteers were and how they played a greater role in the storytelling. And so we have these two Indigenous dancers that just graduated from NAISDA, and they've done a lot of work with Bangarra. And dancers make beautiful puppeteers because they're so physical. And I see their role as an extension to Fingerbone Bill and part of that education. So they introduce Mrs. Fairy Penguin. They manipulate the landscape. They are Proud Ponder and Mr. Percival. They are all those things. They are the tempest. They are the witness to the story. They are part of the greater lesson that Storm Boy learns, and they're the first things you see and the last things you see. So conceptually, it was very interesting exploring that, and it's pulled together in a very wonderful and simple way. So that has been an incredible journey, really. As I said, our Pelicans are to scale. They've been a lot of fun, and they are very naughty, and it's wonderful what the puppeteers do. It's an incredible skill set to be able to make yourself disappear and breathe life into the puppet. And when we were in Wollongong just recently, it was very funny to be outside in the foyer after one of the shows, and there's this great debate going on between these 14-year-old boys going, yes, but when did they bring on the real pelican, the real life pelican? Like, you didn't see that swap over. And, they thought Mr. Percival was an actual real pelican. They were so engaged in it. It was wonderful. And they were having this great debate at the point where it turned from a puppet to a real pelican. look, we have had a wonderful time. It's such a beautiful story, as we all know, which is why we're all here, and it's been a great privilege to work on it. And particularly for me as a childhood, loving that story so much and it being a part of my world and growing up, to be able to work on it and hopefully honour it. And Jan, I'm very nervous that you're coming tomorrow because I hope you really hope you like it. We've had good reviews and it sells out, and I think it's a wonderful testament to Colin Thiele and this beautiful, beautiful story that he's created. And as I said, as I was talking about earlier, about like Sean Tan, like John Marsden and Colin Thiele, there's a wonderful way that they can grab a theme, hold of a theme like death, and make it accessible to young people without patronising them, without scaring them. And I think that Storm Boy is that, you know, and Mr Percival teaches the boy the greatest lesson, you know, about letting go and moving forward. And that's why it sits here in my heart and always will be in my heart. And I think it's been the biggest gift to be able to work on this. So I hope you all get to see it while it's here. It's only a short time, but I look forward to seeing you afterwards in the foyer. And Jan, I look forward to having a chat with you afterwards. I'll open it up to a few questions. We do. We have music, and it's a very simple piano score, an original piano score. That's all. That's it. It's Kingsley Reeve again wrote the music and sat there. Kingsley Reeve being the sound designer that recorded the landscape and put it all together and put the big storms together too. There's some wonderful storms throughout it. Created this very simple and beautiful musical piece to accompany it. Great. Well, thank you very much for having me. I look forward to seeing you there.
Thanks very much for that talk, John. I was sitting there thinking, well, when I get up and speak in public, people lean forward, but most of them are asleep. Anyhow, I would now like to ask Walter McVitty to come and talk to us. As Nick mentioned, Walter published 14 of Colin Thiele's books. So, the floor is yours, Walter.
What a wonderful teacher John would have made, a school teacher. Enthusiasm is everything, I think, in teaching. That's what you get in Colin Thiele's novels. I wish I had a maths teacher when I was in high school who was enthusiastic about maths. I was never any good at it, but if you can catch enthusiasm, it's one of the great things in life, I think. John would be a wonderful teacher, as Colin Thiele was. I was in awe, back in 1971, in awe of Colin Thiele when I first met him, because I had read his books from Sun on the Stubble onwards and really, really loved them. And I was incredulous, really, that I was at the time lecturing in a teachers' college, and I knew what an onerous job it would be to be principal of a teachers' college, 24-hour-a-day job. And when I first met Colin in 1971, I knew that as well as being principal of a teachers' college in Adelaide, he'd also written in his spare time, that's to say after midnight, a history of education in South Australia and a biography of Hans Huyssen. Now, that would be a life's work for most people to write something like that. And I wondered how could he do it? And so when I met him in his office in Adelaide in 1971, and I said, how did you manage it? And he said, well, you just get on with things. He said, when you go to bed at night, you probably go to sleep. He said, that's when I start work. I switch off writing my biography of Hans Huyssen or the history of education in South Australia, and I write books or research books or whatever it was. You just get on with it, and it was just so typical of Colin. Little did I imagine that I would one day become his publisher. So how did that come about? Well, publishers receive in the mail every day dozens of unsolicited manuscripts, they call them. Manuscripts that they've never asked for, but people, would-be writers, have sent in hoping that they'll get published. The chances of being published are very, very slim, about 1 in 100 for unsolicited manuscripts. But publishers have what they call readers. And I was a reader. These are freelance people who the publishers trust their judgment, and they'll, if a manuscript comes in, the publisher reads it, not too sure whether it's any good or not, will send it on to readers, and the readers will read it and write a report and recommending whether they should publish it or not. Well, I had been doing that for Rigby publishers for some years. I was on a retainer from them to write reports on books, including some of Colin Thiele's. Anyway, I had done a lot of work with advising Rigby about Seashores, a book called Seashores and Shadows. And but Colin didn't know that at all. He wouldn't have known who I was, I don't think. But I was at a book launch in Sydney one night when someone came and whispered in my ear, "Have you heard the story about Rigby publishers?" And I said, "No, what?" And he said, "Well, they're folded today. The boss came back from England and told them all they were sacked. He was closing down Rigby, and that was it." Well, I had been working on this novel of Colin's, Seashores and Shadows. I was very much a hands-on editor. And I thought, well, here's this manuscript just lying there. Colin Thiele won't even know about this himself, that it's not going to be published by Rigby. And I know all about this manuscript. I know it inside out. And I thought, what a shame. I wonder who'll publish it. And driving home from this book launch I was doing, my wife said, "Well, why don't you publish it yourself?" Something that hadn't occurred to me. So I immediately got in touch with Colin, who really didn't know who I was, saying that I knew all about his manuscript, Seashores and Shadows. Would he let me publish it? And he said yes, which was a wonderful act of faith, really. I mean, he was the writer, and I was a nobody, really. Although I was very well known in the children's book field because I was lecturing about it and writing for newspapers and articles and so on. But anyway, so I got the book all ready and printed and took it to the Bologna Book Fair, which is around Easter time every year. All the publishers of children's books from all around the world all converge for 4 days where they're trying to buy and sell rights, foreign rights to particular novels. Well, with Seashores and Shadows, it was the only book that I had to take to Bologna with me. And I sold it to 9 different countries just like that. And the people on the Australian stand at the Bologna Book Fair were amazed because some of them had never, ever managed to sell a book rights to anybody, even to their own parent companies in the UK. Well, from then onwards, I published a book of Colin's almost every year, and a highlight of those days was receiving unannounced, always unannounced, in the mail, a new Colin Thiele manuscript. It was really thrilling. Now, unpublished authors, the ones who sent in the unsolicited manuscripts, generally speaking, tend to think very highly of their work. With 100 books to his credit, Colin was the opposite. He once sent me a manuscript and I said, "Look, I'm not too sure about this one." He said, "I wouldn't be at all surprised if you told me to throw it in the rubbish bin." Well, I read it and I got in touch with him and I said, "Yeah, I think you should throw it in the rubbish bin." And he did. So to work with a man like this was an editor's dream. I mean, you see here the wealth of beautiful stuff to work with. Colin had a love affair with the English language, I mean, which, as we've heard, he didn't speak until he went to school. And the sound of words in English just captivated him. And to appreciate his love of language, the sound of language, you heard a lot of sound here, and his passion and his desire to share this love of sounds with others. I'll read you a bit of one of the picture books that he did for us called Farmer Schultz's Ducks. It starts off, "In the hills of South Australia, there is a little river with a big name, the Onkaparinga. Now, he could have picked names of half a dozen other places, I suppose, but Onkaparinga is a sort of word that appealed very much to Colin Thiele. When I lived in the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, and my granddaughter would come and stay with us sometimes, and I'd take her down to the beach and so on. Where are we going today, Papa? And I'd say Maroochydore. Oh, she'd say Maroochydore, Maroochydore, and she'd go dancing around the house saying Maroochydore, Maroochydore. And where are we going tomorrow, Papa? And I'd say Mooloolaba, Mooloolaba, Mooloolaba. And she was just thrilled by just the sound of it. And if you know northeastern Victoria, they've got some wonderful place names like that. Dangdongadale. Imagine living in Dangdongadale, or Dedarang, or Yakandanda, or Mudgegonga. What a name of a place. And in Canberra, things like, I suppose, Tidbinbilla. Anyway, to get back to this, in the hills of South Australia, there's a little river with a big name, the Onkaparinga. Once upon a time, it flowed through a lovely valley full of apple trees and cabbage patches, pastures and gardens, red gums and poplars. In springtime, there was celery on the breath of the wind and falling blossoms like confetti on the slopes, as if the hills were having a wedding. Well, who else would have thought of such an image? In autumn, the willows bowed down by the river with branches like arches of gold. And in winter, the tall trees whipped the air in the wind and the wet, and the high water in the river went fussing and scolding on its crooked way. There were cows in paddocks with udders as heavy as backpacks. There were ducks with necks of opal and wings of amethyst. Their colours gleamed in the sunlight. Their feathers shone like jewels. This is the language of somebody in love with words, isn't it? There were ducks with the sheen of emerald, of sapphire and turquoise and jasper, like the glint of Aladdin's treasure. There were ducks like burnished gold. This is like the Song of Solomon. There were drakes as well, brown drakes, mottled drakes, muddy drakes, drakes with eyes like night, and hills like scoops, bills like scoops. There were great white drakes with noses redder than roses, and ducklings as tiny as tennis balls and as soft as bubbles of golden wattle when it bloomed on the hills by the Onkaparinga River. And then he started the story about Farmer Schultz's ducks. But what about that word bubbles? You say it to yourself, bubbles. It's a wonderful word. Colin loved telling jokes. And if you're in the room with Colin and he heard a joke, his laughter was, I've never known it from anyone else. When he laughed, it was like an explosion, wasn't it? He exploded, just bang, like that. Now, at this point, there was a story that I was going to tell you of one of his jokes, one of his stories that he told to a group of German farmers in the Barossa once when he took me along. But my wife advises me not to do so, and she who must be obeyed. She thinks this story may not be suitable. In 1987, an 11-year-old girl wrote to Colin asking if he would write a story about a child with juvenile arthritis. Now, she knew about that from, some notes that she'd read. Where are we? Yes, this girl said, would you write a story about a child with juvenile arthritis? My friends don't seem to understand why I can't run or play lots of games that they play. And by you writing this book, maybe they will understand, she told him. And so he did. In Jodie's Journey, which we published, in which the gritty young arthritic girl says, you can't afford to drop your bundle. You have to get on top of it or it'll get on top of you. Well, that's Colin all over, I think. He once said, writers can't afford to sit and wait for shafts of divine inspiration to fall on them like rays of Pentecostal light. They need to rely on their own creative energy. They need simply to get on with it. In his office back there in 71, when I was asking him about it, how can you do all this stuff? He said, well, you just need to get on with it. He said he has no time for the idea of writers sitting at their typewriters and nicking out to check at their mailbox all day long because they want any excuse to actually get away from writing. He said, you put your bum on your seat and you start to work, even if it's midnight or 1 a.m. And getting on with it is what he always did. His rapport with children was really exceptional because he never forgot the boy that he once was. His experience as a teacher gave him special insight into the lives of children, the inner lives of children, and how to use this insight not just in teaching them effectively, but in writing for them as well. This is how he expressed it in his own words. The influence of the emotions on human response interested me from an early age. It seemed that while we taught with the intellect, we learnt with the heart. As a teacher and writer, I was therefore very conscious of the fact that children had feelings and that these often dominated their days, buoying them up or weighing them down. There was little point in trying to hammer principles of mathematics or science into them when their hearts were breaking over the death of a pet or violence at home or the sense of personal failure. Colin drew upon his own boyhood in a number of books, the first of which was The Sun on the Stubble, which kept me chuckling with laughter into the early hours of the night when I first read it, way back in 1961 that was, yeah. And 35 years later I was proud to publish this wonderful book, The Sun on the Stubble, in a new edition, giving it a renewed life in a deluxe format with the kind of loving design I had always felt the book deserved, with superb oil paintings which I'd commissioned from an artist named John Lennox. Perhaps that special edition is an expensive collector's item by now, but if you haven't seen it, try and track it down and then read it again to remind yourself what a superbly enjoyable piece of storytelling it is. I designed that sumptuous edition of Sun on the Stubble as a kind of personal tribute to Colin himself, but the final publishing tribute was to be with Dew on My Boots, a memoir of his own childhood written for adults, although children could read it easily. As it was an account of growing up in a very particular place, the Barossa Valley area, at a very particular time, the Great Depression, I wanted this book to have pictures to illustrate almost every single thing mentioned in the text. You know, harvesters and trademarks for things like Goanna Salve and Zambuck, and advertisements like Hoytson-Reuter's Altona Drops, and pictures of the Tanunda Town Band. I spent a whole year combing through pictorial archives and old books and newspapers in the Mitchell Library in Sydney and the Queensland State Library, collecting heaps of pictorial material and getting stuff from the South Australia as well. I absolutely loved it. It was one of the best years of my life. It was just collecting all this stuff. I loved it. Colin, being a methodical, painstaking, detailed-oriented man he was able to give me a lot of little documents from the early 1930s, even down to a handwritten invoice for his first bicycle lamp, which cost him 5 shillings and 6pence. Colin's friend, the late Max Fatchin, once said of him, "Colin Thiele is a quiet man and a gentle one. It's the gentleness of great strength and the quietness of an enormous well of peace and conviction that the man has inside of him. He has, without noise or sensation, reached out and with his warm genius touched the hearts and minds of countless people. He offers us, without bombast, the proposition that the human spirit is alive and well, and that we can all coexist, that issues can be discussed and examined with friendliness, that we do not have to pound each other to pieces to impress society." That's Max Fatchin's words. Colin Thiele, the most amenable, talented, hardworking, modest and versatile of storytellers and the least egocentric, was the most remarkable and inspiring man that I have ever met. He's my number one hero. I feel privileged to have known him. E.B. White said at the very end of Charlotte's Web, It's not often that comes along who is a true friend and a good writer. Charlotte was both. And so for me was Colin Thiele. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Walter. One of the things as a volunteer with the Rees archives is that you don't have to be there for very long before you're well acquainted with the name Walter McVitty. I think you should be consider yourself privileged tonight, because I think you've just heard a legend in the publishing field. And by the way, when I was young, Onka Parinka was a brand of blanket, not a river. I'll now ask Emeritus Professor Bell Alderman, Director of the Rees Archives of Australian Children's Literature, to give it its full title, to round off the evening with a few final comments. Bill?
We did promise you that you would hear about the man and the legacy, and I think that has certainly come true tonight. I don't think I've ever been so regaled with amazing stories, a sense of the man, a sense of a person, a sense of a writer. I do want to go back and read all of Colin Thiele's books again, even though there are several hundred of them in different editions. But I think what we've heard tonight has given us a sense of storytellers tell from the heart. And from each of the people that you heard from tonight, they were telling of Colin Thiele from the heart, how he's touched generations of people, how he will be a classic for the future. Even John Sheedy was saying the reason why he chose this story was because it touched his heart. That's the importance of Australian children's literature, and literature full stop. If we can touch the hearts and the minds of people, we will all be the better for it. We will all be a better society. We couldn't have had a better example from Colin Thiele than Margaret Carmody, talking from an academic point of view, but still giving us a sense of place and time and how he touched the heart. And Jan, we're just so appreciative of your giving us a sense of the man, the father, and the person that he was. And Walter, I knew this was going to be inspirational because you are that kind of person. But thank you again, not only for supporting the Rees Archives as you have, and Jan as you have, and Margaret as well, but thank you tonight for giving us insights into Colin Thiele that we would never have had at any other time or place. So it's a very special evening, and I'm so glad that many of you were able to come. Now I have a special gift for each of you, which is the story of the Rees Archives. Of course, we want to share that with you. So thank you so much for coming, and let's thank everyone for speaking again.